My name is Jim Mitri. I'm the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Program here at RAND, and to have the distinct privilege of introducing today's event. There's two parts to it. There's a keynote address followed by a panel discussion, and it centers around a recently released RAND report entitled Inflection Point: How to Reverse the Erosion of U.S. and Allied Military Power and Influence. With thanks to the Smith Richardson Foundation for sponsoring this research, the report takes on an ambitious set of research questions to both diagnose existing U.S. defense strategy and prescribe a new one. In particular, the report lays out a set of concrete recommendations on how the U.S. Defense Department, in close collaboration with key allies, should adjust its operational concepts, force posture, capabilities to buck recent trends causing an erosion of U.S. military advantage. Such an ambitious aim can only be addressed by bringing together numerous subject matter experts from a range of disciplines across RAND. To this end, we have a healthy panel today composed of the report's authors, all of whom are with the RAND Corporation. First, there's Mr. Andy Hone, who's the Senior Vice President for Research and Analysis, who holds a range of expertise, including in defense strategy and force planning. Mr. David Ochmanek, Senior International Defense Researcher, who specializes in force planning. Ms. Anna Dowd, Senior International Defense Researcher and European Security Specialist. Dr. Jeffrey Hornung, Senior Political Scientist, who specializes in Japanese and East Asian security and foreign policy. And Mr. Michael Mazar, who's a Senior Political Scientist and with specialty in strategy and deterrence. The other report author who's not with us here today is Dr. Steve Flanagan. Now, this panel of report authors will be moderated by Dr. Caitlin Lee, who's the director of RAND's Acquisition and Technology Policy Program. The discussion will last about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. There are microphones for those of you in the Washington office, and for those of you online, we'll be using Slido. The link is in the invite, but also in the chat online. Please state your name and affiliation when you're asking a question. A quick note, if you do participate in the Q&A session, you agree that RAND will record you and make that recording publicly available. Now, to set the stage for the panel discussion, we're honored to have Lieutenant General Clint Highnote join us today to provide a keynote address. General Highnote is a recently retired Air Force officer who had an illustrious career in the United States Air Force. He most recently served as the Deputy Chief of Staff, Strategy, Integration, and Requirements at Air Force Futures and Deputy Executive Director of the Air Force Warfighting Integration Capability, AFWIC. General Highnote, we're grateful for you joining us today. And the floor is yours, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Appreciate it. Okay, good morning. I don't know about you, but I am really excited about this. I'm excited about today. I'm excited to be with colleagues and friends, fellow sojourners on this journey of change that we've been on. And it's an honor to be able to talk about some of the background that led to this report. I think this is a fantastic piece of work. It's much needed. And I was thinking this morning about another book that has really affected me. That book is by a coach named Marshall Goldsmith. It's What Got You Here Won't Get You There. I read that book a few years ago. It's a tough read if you're a leader who is in the middle of your journey. And it sometimes is a challenge to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I need to change. What I hope for this report is that it serves much the same purpose for our defense community, to include the Department of Defense, our allies and partners, the industry, companies that are doing such a fantastic and sometimes difficult job to produce the things that we're going to need, and all of the other folks in the community who need to change. Why do we need to change? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. The world changed, and we have to change with the world. And so I think that there's a backstory here that is important for us to be able to remember as we look forward and we think about the key recommendations that are in this report. So there's no great place to start, but I'm going to give you the story from my perspective, and I know my colleagues are going to give you the story from their perspective as well. But I happened to be in Iraq and happened to be helping in the fight against ISIS, and was very, very, very consumed with the fight of the day. And that was back in the days of the Battle of Mosul, which was one of the most difficult battles of this era. And I will tell you that what the Iraqis did and what we did in support was very, very consequential. So coming back, I had an opportunity to go to a new cell. That was a cell for it was kind of looking at the future. What kind of forces are we going to need in the future? It looked like we were wrapping up the forever wars on terrorism, and we had to do something different. And I didn't really know what to expect because I had been out of that business for a while. And one of the things that happened when I first came back is I was introduced to something called the overmatch brief. Hopefully you've heard of the overmatch brief. If you haven't heard of the overmatch brief, the primary author is sitting here and also the primary author of this report. And Dave put together a brief with the Office of Net Assessment that started to change the conversation within Washington, D.C. There is a wonderful recounting of the effect of that the overmatch brief in Chris Brose's book, The Kill Chain. The preface, the opening of that book recounts how that brief landed. And you can imagine that it landed really poorly. Why did it land poorly? Well, one of the findings of the report was that I think it was 18 of our war games that we examined 18 war games that we felt like had a pretty good set of rigor and analysis, modeling, and simulation behind them, the things that you need for a war game to be helpful in understanding the future. There were 18 of them, and we were not doing so well. I think it was 17 and 0-1, or 17 and 1 is the way we were thinking about it, maybe 0-18. One of those war games had just been done by the cell I joined, and I got a chance to see the real debrief. You know, the real debrief is the debrief that's given in private, right? Not the one that you give out to everybody else around the building in the Pentagon. And I got a chance to see the real debrief, and that debrief went poorly. It went something like this. We have tried to fit our way of war into these war games for the past umpteen times, and it doesn't work. We should do something different. That happened to be I'm quoting the head of wargaming inside of the Air Force at the time, and he was giving that brief to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force. And I remember thinking, oh goodness, what have I gotten myself into? So about that time, it became apparent that the Department of Defense's strategy was changing. So this is around the time of the release of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. And I will tell you, the National Defense Strategies of previous years were bad, to use a technical term, in that they were strategies that didn't really choose. There wasn't any, they were aspirational, but they didn't really do anything. You didn't change what you were doing in the Department of Defense by reading the previous national defense and national military strategies. Well, this one you did. This one was written under the pen of a lot of smart people and a lot of friends of ours. One of them was Secretary Mattis, and he put a lot of weight on that strategy. And he had been thinking about it for a long time. That strategy made choices. It set priorities. It told you, you better go solve these things. And I remember thinking to myself, after reading the overmatch brief and after reading the National Defense Strategy, I remember looking at the key operational problems that were outlined in the new National Defense Strategy. And these were things like, how can you do logistics while your logistics lines are being attacked? What is that? We haven't done that in so long. We probably don't even know how to do that anymore. And I remember thinking through those operational problems, and I was pretty depressed. I remember thinking, I have no idea how we're going to do these things. So we began a process. And that because you have to go through a process. The first thing you have to do is get to some level of acceptance that you need to change. And we did get to that pretty quick. Although I would tell you some of the Department of Defense in the United States is still going through that process of grieving the past and moving on to the future. But we began a process, and that process included diving into the strategy and really pulling out from it what you could about what does it really, really require. And we read every word of it. We whiteboarded it. We talked about what it looked like. And we began doing things that we called experimental war games. One of those games we called the futures game, but there were several of these experimental war games that we were just talking earlier about the countless hours that we have spent with a few of our friends here in this room doing war games. We learned a lot from those war games. But when we looked at the strategy, we figured out a couple of things. The first was we needed something to focus on. One of the interesting theories about change and about leading change within a large organization is it is often very helpful for us to focus on a particular operational problem or a particular scenario. And in fact, what we figured out pretty early on is we needed a scenario that we could really look at, analyze, and figure out how to solve it. And that scenario became the Taiwan defense scenario. Now, I will tell you, there were a lot of folks who didn't like that. That was not a welcome message within many parts of the Pentagon and beyond. Why is that? Well, I think that there's a really good reason. And that reason is the Taiwan scenario challenges every service's long accepted and not often analyzed paradigms. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll just go through them because I actually enjoy this now. I can actually do this and not get too many people wrapped around the axle. Well, the Taiwan scenario challenges the idea of surface vessels, naval vessels, especially the carrier strike group, which of course is the building block of our Navy. And it challenges because the Chinese have figured out how to use an anti-access area denial system to target the carrier and to target the things that support the carrier, and that they've built real missiles that go really fast and that are very harmful to surface vessels. And it's very difficult to see how the old way of projecting American power through a carrier strike group works. Large land formations. Well, there's an adage that you should never get into a land war with Asia. And I think that's probably true. And I think most of our policymakers agree with that. So it's very difficult to see how large land maneuver formations make a huge difference in a scenario where you're defending an island from an attack that's coming from another mainland area across a body of water. It's also difficult to see how you would use the Marine Corps' long-held views about amphibious assault, because what we found was once the island fell, once the Chinese Communist Party has control of the island, it's almost impossible to dislodge them, and certainly not with the force sizes that we would want to use, and the cost would be prohibitive for any political leader. And so it's hard to see how that would work. And I'm going to pick on my own service now. It's really hard to see how a bunch of neat, and I'm a fighter pilot, so I can say this, how all these great fighters can get to the fight and actually do the things they're supposed to do when their bases are being attacked by literally hundreds of missiles over multiple waves a day. And then I think the Space Force had the worst problem of all. Of course, the Space Force wasn't quite formed yet, but we were talking about it. And they actually had to think about warfighting in space, and they had not done that very much. And it was a huge change for them. So the Taiwan scenario tended to challenge all of us and somewhat equally. And I thought that was a good idea. And I argued for the Taiwan scenario to be the driving scenario. It wasn't just me, but in the end, that's what won out over the loud objections of a lot of people. That's just the truth. At the same time, we actually delved into the strategy itself, and we tried to come up with what you might call a theory of success or a theory of victory. So what is a theory of success? And what I will tell you is it's important for a leader, if I'm going to go lead us into some sort of combat environment, I need to have a story that I can tell you as our followers, as our team, about how military force does something good. I have to have a story about how you use military force to get to something better on the other side. Now, I'll be honest with you, a lot of those war games that we had been looking at, they ended in a much worse state than had we just chosen not to fight. That's a little sobering for a military that had been telling itself for years and years and years, we're the best in the world, best that has ever been. And yet what we were seeing is the cost of war far outweighed the benefit. Well, you have to have a theory about how that changes. And so we came up with a theory of success. And that theory revolved around something that I think people have gotten a little hung up on, and I want to clear the air on it. And it's the idea of a denial strategy. What do I mean by a denial strategy? It's really just simply you're going to deny the enemy the opportunity to do what they wanted to do. So if the enemy wants to invade Taiwan and take it over as the new province, as the old province of its country, then you have to figure out a way to stop it. And so denial in the case of the Taiwan scenario was clearly a stopping of the invasion. It's one thing to say we're going to hurt China if they go and try to attack Taiwan. And certainly there are ways we could hurt China. But what we found in our experience as we talked with people at this table and many, many others, is we found that if China, if the Chinese Communist Party, if the People's Liberation Army is able to subdue the island of Taiwan, that there was almost nothing that we could do to change that outcome. And the right strategic thing to do at that point would be to go back to trading with them in a few months. Not to do anything else and then not to try and reverse it, but to actually say, okay, you got it. We call that the fait accompli. Because if they could do it, and if they could do it fast enough, there was almost nothing that the United States or any of our allies and partners could do to reverse the outcome. We would just have to live with it. And China knew this, by the way. Their theory was the fait accompli. So our theory was you have to stop the invasion. That does not mean it looks like you're chasing every Chinese ship back to Beijing with their tails between their legs. What it does look like is that you bog it down. And because an invasion of Taiwan would be the most difficult and complex military operation in history, and I don't put any qualifiers on that, the most difficult and complex military operation in history. In Normandy, you didn't have space and cyber, and it's easily as tough as Normandy. So and I see somebody with their Veterans Day poppy over there, and I'm telling you, all of the initial plans that went into the beginnings of World War I. That was a complex plan that got bogged down. And what we were going to do was bog down what China was doing. And we found we could do that. We found there were, in fact, very good ways of doing that. So that was called deny. We were going to bog down the invasion and figure out how to stop it, to culminate it, to make it so messy that they could not gain the things they were trying to do by making the decision to invade. And so after that, what we saw was it gave us an opportunity, and by us, I mean our allies and partners in the United States, to widen the conflict. Now, everybody says, well, you don't want to widen the conflict. Well, to a degree you do, but you don't necessarily want to widen it militarily. What you absolutely want to do is put an economic cost on China, to put a diplomatic cost on China, to be able to get others around the world to bandwagon or to balance against China, and be able to stop the momentum toward some sort of attack on Taiwan. And that included things like economic warfare. It included very, very difficult diplomatic actions. And it might include military expansion as well. But it would be military expansion into theaters, into areas where we would have an advantage, and we would be able to exert a higher and higher and higher cost. So think about the situation that the Chinese leaders would face. Their invasion wasn't working, and they were losing their ability to project power in the future. We felt like that was the best way of using military force to get to something that was better on the other side. And what that would look like is, look, we didn't choose that China would go to invade. It's not our choice. It's not our choice to, I mean, if Taiwan fights, we're going to fight with them. That's not our choice either. We didn't choose any of these things. We didn't choose Russia invading Ukraine. We didn't choose that Ukraine would fight back, but that's where we are. That's the world as we live in it. But I think that it's important for us to remember that if Taiwan is fighting, and we're with them and we're fighting with them, that there are things we can do to make it better in the end. And we can use military force to make it better in the end. And keep Taiwan free, which last time I checked, Taiwan does some pretty important things for the world economy. And I don't think that any of us want to see a world where the free people of Asia are not producing the wealth and the prosperity that Asia is producing at the moment and will continue to produce during our lifetimes. So with that, what I'll close this up with is that as we looked and as we saw the strategy and as we looked at the operational problem of the defense of Taiwan, and as we thought of the theory of success is deny plus, you deny the invasion and you add the other parts of the conflict to it to dissuade China from continuing, we found that you needed a certain type of force. That's what this report is all about. This is the type of force you need. You need a better force posture. That is, you have to be positioned in a place where you could actually be credible in this denial thing. You have to have the ability to sense what the adversary is doing. You've got to know where they are and what and you've got to do it with some degree of precision. You've got to have awareness. You've got to understand what they're doing, and you've got to be able to counter it. That's the third part. You've got to be able to stop it. And by stopping, I mean attrition. It doesn't mean that you attrit the entire force, but it absolutely means you attrit enough of it to render it ineffective in what it's trying to do, which is to project force onto an island. And then finally, you need to be ready to fight in other parts of the world as well, and to do other things, and to, even if you have to, inflict attrition in other ways. And those are the four pillars that are in Inflection Point. And the rest of the book talks about how to make that a reality. And I'm really excited that we have something like this that we can refer to and talk about and enjoy. But also my hope is that the people across the street here who are doing things like the Defense Management Action Group right now, the DMAG season is in full swing. They are building the budget for next year's submission, even as we're going to fight it out over this year's budget, which really we should have been fighting it out earlier this year, but we'll see how that goes. But the finishing touches on the budget that will be submitted in the spring are happening right now. They could do a lot worse than to reference this book as they're making those decisions. In fact, my hope is that they will reference this book as they're making those decisions, because this could also be a scorecard for the Department of Defense and how we're doing. If we're getting to some of these things, we're probably doing pretty well when it comes to changing our military and our approach to defense. Unfortunately, if you're not seeing a lot of this stuff in the budget that drops, you're probably not seeing a lot of change. And that's just the way it is right now. So with that, I'm going to turn it back and we're going to have a great discussion with Caitlin. But I just want to say how honored I am to be a little bit of a part of the movement of change that has been happening and is happening and will happen going forward. I'm optimistic. Change is the watchword. We're not changing far enough. We're not changing fast enough, but I am seeing real change. And I'm optimistic about our future, even in the midst of the challenges that we face. So with that, thank you so much. Appreciate this time.
Thank you so much for that, General Hinote. If I just listening to your remarks just now, and it brought me back to a Wall Street Journal article that came out last year on great power competition. And you had this killer line at the end, which was just like, we know exactly what we need to do. We understand the operational problems we need to solve. We just need to change our force design to do it. So I am really happy to be here today with the people who are really thinking that through. My name is Caitlin Lee. I'm the Director of Acquisition and Technology Policy here at RAND Corporation. And I'm honored to be here today to just moderate this panel on force planning and military analysis issues, specifically as they pertain to great power competition. One thing I wanted to note was, Dave Ochmanek taught me a long time ago that one of the things about force planning is it's a bit of a dark art and it takes a really multidisciplinary approach. You need active duty, you need civilians, you need strategists, you need subject matter experts on the countries, the allies, partners, your adversaries. You need engineers, you need ops analysts, you need analysts, you need all of these people to do force planning the right way. And this panel is an amazing cross-section of some of the people that are really at the top of this field. And it's a small community, but it's a very influential one, and it's a really important one. So I'm really honored to present this, moderate this today. And with that, I want to give each of these panelists a moment to talk about sort of their bottom line up front, what they really took away from doing the research that supported this, this new work. And so with that, I'll kick it over to Dave first.
Thanks, Caitlin. The only downside to having Clint Hinote come here is that he says everything better than we. So I'm going to just try to fill in a couple of pieces of background to amplify what he said. So Operation Desert Storm, Operation Deliberate Force, Bosnia, Operation Allied Force, Kosovo, Iraq 2, Afghanistan. These are all triumphs of American arms. And the good thing about that is our forces achieved their objectives promptly with few human costs. The bad news is that complacency can breed, or success can breed complacency. And those operations spurred efforts by our adversaries, principally China, but also others, to find ways to ensure that we could not do to them what we did to Saddam Hussein and Slobodan Milosevic. At RAND, we started doing quantitative analysis of warfights with China around 2000. And we were finding some disquieting things, like the fact that precision strike was proliferating, and that these capabilities in the hands of adversaries could create serious problems for forward-based forces. Our first major war game of the Taiwan scenario with government people took place in 2008. And this game, like many others that followed, featured blue teams coming swaggering into the game, thinking they could use the same approach to power projection that works so well against the Iraqs and the Serbias of the world against China. And as General Hinote said very clearly, they consistently failed when that was tried. The power projection approach that U.S. forces used in the post-Cold War era had two principal features. One, it was expeditionary. The bulk of the force that was sent to fight the war came from somewhere else after a decision to intervene. And two, it was sequential. The opening phase of the war was devoted to gaining dominance over the battle space, right? We went after the air defenses, we shattered the command and control, we created a permissive environment for the joint force to do what it needed to do. And these features were okay in a world where we had dominance over the adversary and we had the initiative. They are fatal flaws when attempted against a country like China, or indeed a reconstituted Russia that can contest for that superiority and can seize the initiative from us We will not have time to deploy that force after a decision is made to intervene. We will not have time to create a permissive environment for the joint force before getting after the operational center of gravity, the invasion force. So after years of war games in which our blue teams repeatedly learned hard lessons, we began to use the games to test hypotheses about different ways to fight. And General Hinote was the sponsor of many of those games, starting in the late teens, following the publication of the NDS that he talked about. What we learned from these games is that it is possible to blunt and defeat aggression by highly capable adversaries, even in a situation where our forces lack domain superiority. And that was a good thing. But achieving this requires more than just buying better stuff. We have to fight differently. This gets to how to achieve that theory of success that General Hinote talked about. And as he said better than I can, it has three main components. One, it is not expeditionary. We have to change our posture in fairly fundamental ways. We have to bring combat power to bear, not in the 5 months it took to build that Iron Mountain on the Arabian Peninsula for Desert Storm, but possibly 5 days. And the forces we deploy to the fight can't be sitting on the ramp at Kadena waiting to get killed. They have to be hardened, they have to be dispersed, they have to be mobile, they have to be defended. That's going to cost money. Two, it's not going to be sequential. We have to reach into that highly contested environment created by Chinese anti-access from the outset of hostilities and find the enemy. This is about sensing in an environment where our air defenses, our enemy's air defenses have not been suppressed, when our space assets are under attack, when we have electronic warfare and cyber and so forth going after our operations centers. And then three, more survivably, more rapidly generating that lethality necessary to blunt and defeat the offensive, both from inside the threat ring and from beyond. If you get your posture right, a lot of this will take care of itself, because you're defending your forces that you're taking to the fight, you're protecting them better, but also ensuring that forces that can operate from beyond the threat ring, our bomber force principally, undersea forces, have more potency, have more staying power than they do today. The forces we have today do not have the capabilities necessary to execute this new approach to warfare. And I would venture to say the forces we are planning to buy by the end of this FIDIP also will lack important capabilities in this area. The focus of the Inflection Point project was to highlight the need for this new approach to warfare, to describe it to people, and to offer ideas about how to make it happen. We chose the title carefully. It's a how-to book, how to reverse this erosion of US and allied power and influence. We think we know the basic approaches to do this. We have to motivate faster and more focused action on it. Caitlin only gave us 3 minutes, so I'm going to stop there and invite you to read the book to get more information about our suggestions for how to make this happen. Thank you.
It's a cliffhanger because we know how, but we've got to ask you some questions about what that looks like. So looking forward to that. Let's turn over to Mike now to talk a little bit about the broader institutional and societal implications here.
So thanks. My part of this actually eventually was broken off into a separate little publication. It was an introductory chapter, sort of studying the institutional context for these arguments. And it was eventually different enough that we've issued it as a separate RAND perspective. The argument is that we absolutely have the gap that we're talking about between the aspirations of our national security strategy and the capabilities to implement it. But my argument is that the main barrier to closing that gap is not budgetary or size of the force, it's institutional. And I think it tells a story essentially that General Hinote, that Dave has started to tell of, having a default defense strategy toward the end of the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period of this decisive expeditionary force that became undermined. The assumptions of that were challenged in a whole bunch of ways. The U.S. defense establishment has recognized that, as General Hinote indicated, and has started to move to close those gaps. But there are significant institutional, bureaucratic, cultural, path-dependent gaps to getting where we need to go. And my argument in this piece is that that is the essential problem with closing these gaps in U.S. defense strategy. It stresses that, to its credit, it's not as if, as again, General Hinote and Dave were both saying, that the U.S. defense establishment is not recognizing some of the problems. But The argument is, my argument is that we are stuck to a significant degree and we're not making changes quickly enough. The debate to be had about that is that no defense institution, especially in peacetime, can be expected to turn over, to the other side of the coin immediately. There are changes underway. The 2018 and 2022 NDSs both represent a significant recognition of these problems and an identification of many of the steps that need to be taken to move in the right direction. And so an argument could be made that particularly for a peacetime military defense establishment, the Defense Department has recognized a lot of the problems and is moving out reasonably smartly to develop the new concepts and capabilities and so on that are required. What I do in this piece is try to develop a rough scorecard. And to do this really in detail would take a lot more research time. But to say, okay, which of those things is true? Are we moving out relatively quickly or are we still mostly stuck? And I look across a variety of areas from, system development to procurement and acquisition to operational concepts that Dave and General Heinelt both spoke about, workforce and personnel issues, a variety of others, where, as was said, there's a general recognition of the direction we need to go. And I try to assess, are we moving quickly enough? In the area of procurement and system development, you've got Defense Innovation Unit, you've got all these innovation offices and the services, you've got a variety of new systems that are being developed. So in each of these areas, you have positive progress, but ultimately I come to the conclusion that we are moving way too slow and that you can see many, that the common conversation with people in the defense establishment who are fighting against this is we all kind of know where we need to go. And every time we try to make the needed change, you run into significant barriers and you end up making about 5 or 10 or 20% of the progress that you think you really should in each of these different areas. So what should we do about this if we want to solve the problem? It's a very big issue. You don't solve these kind of institutional problems overnight. One of the arguments I make is that we could begin to pick 1 or 2 of these areas, put together, because you're going to have Congress involved in this. Some of the barriers are congressional, they're regulatory, they're legislative. Put together an executive, legislative, almost a tiger team designed to develop a strategy and agenda for making more rapid progress on implementation of unmanned systems, on workforce and personnel reform, on, procurement is such a big area. So you would pick one particular area of that and really have high-level attention to saying, we are going to crack open some of these barriers and begin to make more rapid change. We're going to have people from the executive branch and the legislative branch, bipartisan, obviously, that see the need to do that. And we are going to begin to make that progress in selected areas to begin to show the potential for more rapid change. I think that's very plausible. I think the general recognition of the need for more rapid change is there. And that's how I would think that, to begin to solve what I think is this most essential problem with closing this gap in our capabilities, the direction we could go.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to turn it over to Andy now.
Caitlin, thank you very much. General Heinelt, thank you for getting us started in such a robust, energetic way. It's a critically important topic, and our belief is that we need everyone here and in the larger community to really be focused on this. This is not just a story about the United States, it's a story about our allies as well. And so as we were constructing Inflection Point, we thought it was not good enough to write a story or prescription or a scorecard for the United States. We need one for our allies because in every instance, we're supporting allies. We're coming to their assistance in the way that General Heinelt described. Michael Lestumbo did the work in this book on Taiwan. He's not able here to be with us today, but I thought I would give a very quick recap of his assessment, his analysis of Taiwan's own position, its own posture, and so forth. This is going to be a familiar refrain. The highlight, the tagline, Caitlin, is really 1-2 of a strategy capabilities mismatch. This was not always the case. If we were to go back to the early to mid 1990s, Taiwan's defense position was quite strong. The ability of the United States to support Taiwan should there been a war over Taiwan would have been sufficient We can all think of what happened in the mid-1990s during the Taiwan Strait crisis. China fired missiles to bracket Taiwan to the north and to the south. Taiwan mobilized its own forces. Importantly, the United States sent 2 aircraft carriers to respond. Only one actually arrived before the crisis was over because China understood it did not have the capability to face both Taiwan and the United States at the same time. Taiwan's done good work on thinking about its own defense. Its approach is one of denial, as General Highnote said to us. Denial, and the way I like to think about it, is one I learned from David Ochmanek. It is about the real prospect of failure. If you can present your adversary with a real prospect of failure, then the ability to deter is successful. Their approach to resist, it's a layered defense approach. It's to resist the opposite shore. It's to attack at sea. It's to destroy in the littoral area, and it's annihilation on the beachhead. So far, so good, right? The problem, as Mike analyzes this, is that Taiwan's equipment, organization, and employment concepts don't match. There's a lot of interaction with Taiwan right now between the United States. Taiwan is taking efforts, but what's really needed is better capabilities to deal with having surface-to-air missile capabilities, to have improved strike capabilities, to have ISR that presents that picture that General Highnote described. And of course, deep magazines. That means having the weapons and capabilities that allow you to see this through. Very familiar story to one of the United States. There is progress underway, but as Mike Mazar says, there's also institutional reforms that are going to be needed in Taiwan if they're going to move at the speed that they need. The ultimate goal here for Taiwan is one of political resilience. That is, does Taiwan, the government, the people, can they present the resilient posture such that if under attack, can they last until this attack is blunted in the way that General Highnote described? I think what's needed most in the United States, what's needed most in Taiwan is a sense of urgency. Caitlin, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Andy. I'd like to turn now to a discussion of overview of allies and partners. So let's turn it over to Anna to talk a little bit about the European theater in particular.
Thank you, Caitlin. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine upended many aspects of European security architecture and forced allies to pivot back to collective territorial defense, and which has altered NATO force requirements in an unprecedented way. And it also really shattered this vision of Europe whole, free, and at peace, facing very little threat of conventional attack. And there's this peace mentality in Europe that was most acute in Germany, and it has given way to a dawning awareness that military power and then also the ability to project that power is needed in the pursuit of security and strategic objectives. And this week, German Defense Minister Pistorius said that we have to become fit for war. And such a statement would have been simply unthinkable 2 years ago. So this war has been a forcing function for allied policy makers and defense planners to address the longstanding shortcomings in defense preparations. And despite, though, increases in defense spending and preparedness, this remains a challenge. And especially of the view of the discontinuity of posture and the downscaling of forces and capabilities since essentially 2002 Prague summit, when it was declared that Russia is no longer an issue for NATO, and NATO is no longer in business of protecting Europe, and NATO since shifted to out-of-area contingency operations for almost 2 decades. And that had huge consequences for posture and capabilities, and exacerbated the erosion of military power of allies. And the NATO and allies then confronted again, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, with this war in the Euro-Atlantic area with uncertain outcome and uncertain duration, started to take some steps to address it. But as General Highnote said, they are, also for Europe, not quick enough and not going far enough. So much more has to be done in the next few years, and over the course of our studies, we looked at specific allies, but also for NATO, and we came up with a set of recommendations. So first, it is really critical for NATO to build a more resilient forward posture for collective defense on NATO's eastern flank, and the US should work very closely with allies to bring all 8 battle groups on NATO eastern flank to brigade strength, and also to enhance the readiness and exercises to realize the fourth generation goals of the new allied force model, whereby allies commit essentially to making 300,000 personnel available to NATO commanders in 30 days. Second, allies must deliver on their commitments to fully resource and regularly exercise the new defense strategy and the family of regional plans that were recently endorsed at the Vilnius summit in July. And that implementation of that strategy, together with the necessary command and control arrangements, should be really top priority, and should be further leveraged to shape the force structure, the readiness requirements, and also the national investments. And in addition to that, to improve enablement and mobility in Europe. And third, allies must work together to implement the newly agreed defense production action plan. And this is to accelerate joint procurement and boost production capacity, including for weapons that can engage hostile forces from standoff ranges. And this should also include a 5-year plan to enlarge munitions inventories in Europe. And then finally, lessons that the Ukrainian military is learning in operations against Russian forces should be applied to NATO defense plans and training. And the establishment of the new NATO-Ukraine Joint Analysis, Training and Education Center in Poland is already underway, and that's certainly really a good step, but prioritizing its work and making it operational quickly would benefit both NATO and Ukraine. And my last remark here, Alliance should also provide Ukraine with the assurances of long-term Western security assistance and training, and a clear path to NATO membership. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I want to call out here that a lot of the theme of this conversation has been around the Indo-Pacific region, which is appropriate. The 22 NDS calls out China as sort of the most consequential threat. But, as Anna highlights, there are real issues in Europe, of course, right now. And a reconstituted Russia is something we also need to be thinking about. So thank you for that, Anna. And then I do want to turn to Jeff, who can talk a little bit about those allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Japan. As many of you know, whenever we talk about China or a Taiwan scenario, Japan always comes up in the conversation. There's a lot of assumptions baked into what we expect of our ally in Japan. A lot of that is understandable. Japan's a highly committed US ally, shared threat perceptions. If you look over the last year, they have increased their defense spending over the next 5 years by 65%. They've issued new strategic documents that are showing a whole range of areas that it's going to invest in and go and work with the United States and other partners with. And over the last 10, 15 years as well, understanding the threat that China poses, we've seen Japan move slightly from a denial strategy to one more based on forward defense, shifting its posture focused heavily toward the north, with a lot of ground units in Hokkaido down to the southwest, focused more on mobility and defending against air and naval threats. So all that is a good news story. But when you look at the self-defense forces by themselves compared to the PLA, it's a significantly smaller force. They do not have nuclear deterrent capabilities. And so by itself, Japan does not provide a combat credible force against China. In the alliance framework, they provide a very important force multiplying role for the United States. And it's within that lens that I examine Japan in the publication. I did argue that, to give credit where credit is due, the self-defense forces have numerous strengths that the United States should continue to support. They have a robust and modern nature of platforms. A lot of FMS from the United States. They have invested heavily in space, cyber, and electromagnetic capabilities in recent years, trying to think about future warfare. And they've also moved to invest in modern munitions, including both defensive systems and most recently counter-strike capabilities. Collectively, these three broad strengths do play into Japan's responsibilities, which is referred largely as a shield. The US-Japan alliance is a shield and spear relationship. Japan's responsible primarily for defending the archipelago, the US for launching more offensive operations. And so through its defense buildup, it does allow the US to focus more on offensive operations in the region and provide those force multiplying roles. However, despite these strengths, I believe there are several areas that Japan has devoted insufficient attention, especially when we think about the problem set of a Taiwan conflict, and areas where I think the United States could work with its ally to strengthen this. I won't go heavily into details given the time constraints, but in the report, I point out problems with the size of the self-defense forces fleet in its fixed wing airlift, as well as its heavy sea lift capabilities. The historical levels of stockpiling of precision guided munitions and a long-term commitment to doing so, as well as passive defense efforts around self-defense force bases. I also look at challenges that the alliance face in its ability to respond to a regional contingency. The first, which has already been mentioned by General Hinote and Dave as well, has to do with posture. Even though the US has a large presence in Japan, the United States does not have the posture, the protection, or capabilities stationed in Japan to execute an operation that is meant to defend Taiwan from a full-scale invasion or a prolonged conflict. The second challenge revolves around something that does not get a lot of attention, and that is questions: what can the United States do from its bases in a conflict if Japan itself is not attacked? This gets into a lot more legal issues that we tend to focus on capabilities, not the nuts and bolts of legal issues so much, but in the report we do. And then finally, I close with some recommendations that I think the allies could focus on to try to make Japan a more robust partner, as well as the US-Japan alliance better positioned for a future conflict. Some of these, re-examining the US posture in Japan to ensure that key gaps are identified and addressed. Linking individual base resiliency efforts to broader alliance posture and plans. Also leveraging Japan's increased defense spending budgets, not just on funding things like air and missile defense and a lot of high-tech systems, but also a robust set of passive defense efforts around Japanese bases. Rapidly increasing not just munitions, but also a robust stockpile of fuel and parts at self-defense force bases. Increasing air and sea lift platforms. And then finally, to clarify what Japan is willing to do in times of war to ensure that its political timelines keep in sync with US operational timelines. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeffrey. I want to call out for, we have a great live audience here today, but we also have some people online, and there is a Slido link in the chat online so you can ask questions. And I know there are some questions in the audience. And so I think actually I'm going to go right over to that. Mr. Gordon, please. Do you like, is there a microphone? Yeah. We'll get, sir, there's a microphone in the back if you don't mind. I think someone's going to bring it to you. So.
Come on up here. So a big question a big issue today, I think, and I'd like to hear some of the panel's views on this, is the simultaneity of the prospective threats we face. And I'm old enough to remember the two major regional contingencies that we couldn't quite attend to. And one of the innovations of the National Defense Strategy that Jim Mitry helped push through was to adopt a one war strategy, basically framework, and in fact wrote a big article on that. And I think some of the thoughts behind that was that if you to build force structure for simultaneous conflicts with China and Russia would be prohibitively expensive. And that also, if you attempted to do it, it would crowd out spending for technology, hypersonics, CJAD, C2, all the good things, innovations that you want to do. However, given the world situation, I noticed the Strategic Posture Commission, for example, said it's time to adopt a two-war strategy, and some of the congressional assessments of the NDS have said that as well. What is your view on how to manage the possibility that there could be simultaneous conflicts with China and Russia, either by design among those powers or opportunistically, because the conclusion of the Strategic Posture Commission is we have to ramp up and enlarge conventional defense or become more dependent on nuclear weapons. Do you have a solution for this? Because I think it's becoming the pressing challenge of the day.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe we'll turn that over to Dave and General Highnote to take a crack at that.
Sure. So there's no denying that our nation has important interests in multiple regions, and there are active threats to those interests. How do you square the circle between the need for accelerated modernization and innovation on the one hand, and the undeniable call for capacity on the other? And the fact that we just sent a couple of carriers to Fifth Fleet to deal with issues in the Middle East reminds us that there's no shortage of demands for U.S. forces to be places to do things that we need as a nation. I think our instinct on this is right, that you must prioritize qualitative enhancements to the force, focus first on China, but then with the famous prepositions, by, with, and through allies in Europe, the time to build a more resilient, more credible defense against threats to the eastern flank of the alliance is now. You don't postpone that. We're a big, powerful, rich country. We can do this. One thing I'll offer is it's not just about the number of jets you have, the number of brigades you have. Increasingly, what we see is that the leverage comes from changes in posture. Are you in the right places? Are you defending those places and protecting them? And investments in enablers. If you can see into that contested environment created by the enemy, if you can locate, identify, track, and target the enemy's invasion force, the lethality part is pretty manageable. So yes, capacity is important, but I think rather than focusing on numbers of things, platforms, let's focus on the posture, the concept, the ability to sense and target, and then buying sufficient munitions that can be delivered into that from a variety of means, again, with our allies. I think you can credibly deter aggression by these powerful adversaries more or less simultaneously. And Jim, you're welcome to tell me I'm full of crap. What do you think, sir?
Please, General Highnote.
Well, one of the things I like about the report is that it's very clear, and it's actually Michael, your question is answered on page 33. I actually have circled it. It's deny plus in 2 critical theaters with all of the caveats that Dave just said. The only thing I'll add is, as I am thinking through the sweep of military history, I think we're at a stage where weaponry is tending to be more defense dominant. And that actually favors what we're trying to do in a deny plus ×2 theaters. In that defense tends to be more economical than offense. And I don't believe we could or should create 2 force postures that are invasive, threatening mainland China, threatening a march on Moscow. I just don't think that's credible. But using weapons in a defensive way, and even if you don't believe that weaponry is growing more defensive dominant, I think you might agree that we could socially construct these these weapons to be defense dominant. And that fits us. It fits our allies and partners. It means that we're the Department of Defense again. And that's a good thing for us. And so as the weaponry migrates more to a defense dominant position, I do believe Deny Plus in two critical areas is a possibility.
Please, Andy.
I'm just going to say a word more about it. Michael, you've followed this for a long, long time. You'll recall that the force planning concept of the old strategy, one that David and I were part of, had an element in it that called for decisively defeating the adversary. That meant invading and occupying the adversary's territory. That's not what we're envisioning in Deny Plus. Now, that's not to make light of the task here. It's an enormous one. But as both David and General Heine would have pointed out, I think it's within our ability to be able to construct a force with our allies to be able to execute on a deny plus strategy.
I love that the first question out of the gate was, whether the two war construct. It's like kind of the canonical force planning question. So that was good. All right. Well, we're happy to take more questions from the audience, please.
Hi, Michael Morrow with Breaking the Fence. I wanted to ask about the challenge of the public support for something like support for Taiwan or Ukraine. We've seen over the past year and a half that support throughout the West really has fallen for Ukraine support. And, you know, what are the challenges with getting the public on board for either of those conflicts? And really kind of the question that I'm getting at is maybe a lesson for China that prolonging, you know, a Taiwan conflict over a long period of time could erode the public support in the West for continuing to back Taiwan.
Thanks, Michael. Good to see you. Michael Mazar, I'm going to kick that one over to you.
Okay. So I think one thing is I'd say, I mean, I think it's a great question. And I would say that I think some of the military operational questions of how you prepare for these contingencies are somewhat separate from the political judgments that you're asking about, right? I do think and have thought for a while that the political questions surrounding the ambiguous but increasingly less ambiguous U.S. commitment to Taiwan are something that deserve a lot more debate in the United States. Because as the games we've all been part of make clear, this would be a conflict unlike anything the United States had fought before, particularly against the nuclear armed adversary. The problem of protraction you mentioned is very real. It's something that people are very aware of, and the nature, the United States faces multiple problems here. One is you can lose very quickly. The other is you can get into a protracted situation where our defense industrial base, our political will, all these other things come into question. So there's not a great answer to your question, and I think it's hard to know in advance. As we've seen before, the United States in 1950 declared that we would not defend Korea, but when the attack happened, it crystallized our thinking about the nature of the threat we were facing. And not only did we defend Korea, but that became the catalyst for the alliance with Taiwan. So it's very difficult to anticipate exactly how the American people and frankly other publics would react to a potentially unprovoked Chinese invasion of a democracy of 24 million people that begins to kill a lot of innocent folks. You could imagine reactions across a wide spectrum. So I wouldn't want to predict that. I would say, first of all, our ability to defend is something that has value regardless of our judgment, unless we were to decide we're just out of this for political reasons. But I would also say this is a choice that is increasingly being made implicitly by the U.S. national security establishment and by, a broader political folks that are involved in this policy across the government in the United States. It is something that needs and deserves more public debate of what the United States is going to do in certain circumstances.
Thanks, Mike. And I'd like to get Andy's take on this one as well.
Just want to make a brief comment about Ukraine in particular. I think your question's a really good one. And when it regards public support, I think there is a puzzle here that we need to wrestle with, and that is the policy capability mismatch. As the war in Ukraine began, there was a lot of doubt about Ukraine's ability to defend itself. It proved that it was not only willing but capable, and did so in amazing, heroic, and admirable ways. But over time, we've had this now growing sense that not only could Ukraine defend itself, but it might win, that is to reclaim all its territory. There's this expectation that Ukraine could be victorious, but it hasn't been provided the capability to do so. So we have an expectation that Ukraine could be victorious, but it doesn't have the military wherewithal, the military capability, all of the support that's associated with that. Those two, I think, need to come into alignment. And to the extent that happens, I could see where the public support, the public willingness then would follow. But right now we have a misalignment.
Thanks, Andy. And while we're waiting for the live audience to work up their courage, we'll go over to the, oh, someone does have a question. Please come up. And I'm gonna just have, actually, please go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Austin Dahmer with Senator Josh Hawley. So dovetailing a little bit with the force planning construct, some of the force development pieces we talked about, but also on the geopolitical level with burden sharing. I mean, two of the most salient findings of the report, right? Today's force, nor the force projected at the end of the FIDEP, is capable of executing the defense strategy, or is not capable. And two, that the military balance leaves open the possibility of a rapid PRC victory. You know, essentially the fait accompli problem with Taiwan. So, you know, we've talked about the one major war force planning construct versus the two MRC, but also, you know, it's fine to say, hey, we need to spend more on defense. One that's sort of not politically tenable in the foreseeable future. But also on the personnel problem, right? The recruiting shortfalls that the US military is increasingly facing in the foreseeable future, using sort of the Army as a case study that gets all of these different aspects of it. The Army's contribution to Pacific campaign, long range fires, air defense, which we are probably an order of magnitude behind on to actually execute the joint warfighting concept, and then logistics. The bureaucratic, you know, sort of incentives and disincentives that Mike gets at in his portion dovetail with all of these things, to include burden sharing with allies and partners and force posture. To the extent that we have major land maneuver BCTs in Europe, this retards the sort of force development initiatives that we need to get to develop the force to actually execute the defense strategy in what I'm told is the primary theater in the Pacific against the primary threat in China. So there's a lot to unpack there, but this is where sort of the force development and the defense piece sort of trades against the geopolitical and the foreign policy piece. And to the extent the answer is spend more on defense, you know, both the temporal aspect, we're in a new FIDEP now since the 2018 NDS. How are we getting at the urgency of this problem, especially in the Pacific? And then not just on the monetary resources, but on the personnel resources. How do we get out of that sort of trick box? Thank you.
Got it. Maybe let's turn that over to Dave first. Do you have any comments on that?
I get all the easy ones. Thanks, Austin. There's no denying that resources are finite. And we face challenges in more than one place that we are not adequately postured to deal with now. That said, and Mike makes this point very strongly in his piece. If you want to convince the Chinese that you are serious about defending your interests globally, arguably the worst thing you could do would be to sort of say to our European allies, you're on your own, or to demonstrate an unwillingness to continue supporting Ukraine against brutal and unprovoked aggression by Russia. Deterrence is about more than bodies and force structure and so forth. It's about your adversaries' perceptions of your will. And we have to show the world, not just our adversaries, but our friends and allies and partners and neutrals, that we remain a geopolitically competent power. The book introduces the concept of the saeculum, which was a period of time that the Etruscans used in ancient times to identify an era in which a generation which had witnessed a historically important event was still alive, right? And back then it lasted 50 or 60 years. The saeculum of the World War II generation is coming to a close. And with it, we risk losing the lessons of World War II that animated George Kennan and Atchison and Truman and others who built the world we live in today. They knew that if the United States doesn't step up to its responsibilities to lead, to be engaged in the world, deep engagement is what Mike calls it, that we could face existential threats to our well-being and our security. It's probably not a coincidence that a substantial portion of our body politic and our political leadership, so-called leadership, seems not to remember that. And so it's important that our far-sighted leaders communicate clearly to Americans, to allies, to partners, to adversaries, that we have not forgotten those lessons and that we have both the capacity and the will to defend important common interests in the world in more than one place at a time.
Thanks, Dave. And please, General High Note.
Yeah, Austin, I get a chance to talk a little bit more freely now that I'm retired. So I can't wait to get into some of the red meat you threw out there. We do not need to spend more on defense than we are spending right now. Period. We need to spend it better. But we're approaching a daggum $1 trillion per year in defense. We can't defend the United States, our allies, partners for that. That's on us as a people. And I will tell you right now, we don't need to spend more. We need to spend it better. That means that there are private and public interests that have to be subordinated to the national interest. I will be specific. When we're getting rid of the J-stars because it is not survivable against any of the threats we've mentioned today, the Georgia delegation doesn't get to have a one-for-one replacement in jobs throughout Georgia. When it is clear that the A-10 does not make a difference in any of the scenarios that we have mentioned today, the Arizona delegation doesn't get to single-handedly say, but we really need it because we might need it for the lesser included cases. And I could go on. I won't go into Missouri, but I could, but what we have seen is that local interests have weakened the national interest when it comes to our defense budget. Secondly, people are too expensive. We are going to get smaller. We are going to be able to do what we need to do, according to this report, with a smaller military. Because if we don't, the expense of the people will crowd out the important things that we have to do in the report. So yes, every service will likely stay level or get smaller going forward. The good news is that when I was talking about the technologies and the defense dominance of those technologies, those require less people. Autonomy helps us with this. Artificial intelligence helps us with this. This can be done. And you mentioned burden sharing. We will never go to war without someone with us. And probably they're doing a lot of the fighting because that's what it looks like as we go forward. One of the things I think we finally got right at the end of the war against ISIS is that we finally figured out that the role of the United States and our allies was not to fight. It was to help the fighting. I credit leaders like Steve Townsend and Paul Funk with this. They every day push back against, for example, the Iraqis. I was there. And they said, no, we're not the ones fighting. You're fighting, we're helping. And they had to hold that line every day. Well, when we're talking about a country being invaded, a country being threatened, it is true that the people on the ground have the most incentive to fight. Our job will be to make their fighting really effective. We can do that for $1 trillion a year. We can do that with a smaller military. But we have to have the freedom to do it. We have to have the political will to do it. So I'll turn it back over to you, Austin, on that.
Thanks. And Austin, what I heard in your question was a real concern about capacity in the Indo-Pacific. And as General Haido mentioned, this partnership building piece of it and the role that allies and partners play. So I just want to quickly turn it over to Jeffrey to talk a little bit about Japan and how they're doing in terms of, we know the military balance is eroding in the Indo-Pacific. What is Japan doing about it? How well are they doing?
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned in my remarks, Japan is investing in a lot. There's going to be, if any fight over Taiwan, the United States is going to look to Japan. I think one of the critical areas, and I mentioned it briefly, but I think, you know, there's been a lot of attention on Japan with getting counterstrike capability. And there's sort of, whether false expectations or real expectations on what it's actually going to do with these capabilities. But when we think about a conflict in Taiwan, and we think about US forces in Japan, I do think that there needs to be more of an attention on the passive defense measures. Not just Japan, by the way, the United States as well, US forces in Japan. Japan has focused a lot on runway repair capabilities. They focused a lot on dispersal pads on existing bases. That's it. And so where we need to see much more attention and sort of missing in a lot of the conversations, especially at the political level in Japan, are things like creating dispersal options at non-self-defense force facilities, hardening existing infrastructure at self-defense force bases, whether that be hardened aircraft shelters, whether that be critical communication, fuel lines, munition depots, and then also things like just investing in decoys, expeditionary shelters, fuel bladders. There's a whole host of things that Japan, I think, could be investing in. It's not going to tilt the military balance, but it's going to allow not just Japan, but the United States to stay in the fight past the first volley, so that a lot of the forces flowing into the theater, getting postured correctly, are going to have a chance. Without this, I just fear that we're going to be losing right from the get-go. I'll stop there.
Thanks for that sobering assessment. Chris Gordon, let's hear from you.
General Haido, I just wanted to follow up on a point you just made on capabilities and needing to bog down an enemy. As we've seen General Zaluzny just say, the commander in chief of Ukrainian forces, that they're in a stalemate. So Russia has not succeeded in its objective. They've been bogged down. So my question to you is, and expand upon this, is if the US is to bog down an enemy, what sort of capabilities are going to be required? Does this have to be largely unmanned because the US cannot put in the amount of resources, the amount of casualties that Ukraine has taken to bog down an enemy, and that the US is simply practically not going to accept that number of casualties that we may have in the past, or that another country may accept?
Chris, it's a really interesting situation that we find ourselves in as we watch real time what a conflict is looking like in Ukraine right now. And I do think that it tends to show us some very important things. I believe that we're looking at a defense dominant scenario where both sides have a lot of difficulty with any sort of offensive movement on the ground, but they are able to hold with a significantly smaller force a defensive line. Now that has cost a lot of lives, and I think as we, because I mentioned the bogging down, the scenario of a Taiwan defense, I don't think we can be we can't be too optimistic that Taiwan won't lose a lot of lives, because it's going to be a terrible, terrible fight. We'll be there with them and we will lose some, but in the end, the the types of technologies mentioned in this report, when you talk about the ability to posture forward, to prepare well, to be able to sense what is going on, to connect the sensors to the shooters through the all domain command and control, to be able to provide a defense in all domains, that's the capability that we are going to need to bog down a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. If Russia was going to try to reconstitute itself and move against NATO, in many ways, the difference would be that you're talking mostly on the ground in Europe versus mostly in the Strait and Taiwan defense scenario, but the capabilities, the sensing, the connecting through command and control, and the ability to affect change on the battlefield, those are all the same. And so when I think about the capabilities mentioned in the report, those are the exact capabilities that we need in order to help another force, which in Taiwan, Ukraine, NATO, to bog down an enemy invasion. And I think that's what we have to focus on as we think about what defense looks like in our time.
Thank you. Over to you, Dave.
Real quick, Chris. Is the imperative to move toward unmanned systems principally driven by casualty aversion? Yes and no. We're 2 points on that. One, we're channeling what Chris Brose said in his book, Kill Chain, pointing out that for decades now, the United States of America has been on a trajectory of spending increasing amounts of money on increasingly exquisite platforms in ever smaller numbers. That's a very fragile posture to take against a highly capable adversary. So we're interested in finding ways to get mass back into the portfolio of US military capabilities, and autonomy and miniaturization of electronics and communications provides us the opportunity to do that. Two, unmanned, particularly for the Air Force, unmanned aerial vehicles have the opportunity to unchain themselves from dependence on fixed facilities, specifically runways and air bases. And we know, as General Hinote said eloquently, it's going to be very tough to operate at tempo when you're under constant attack by highly precise weapons. I want to give the scud hunting problem to China. If he wants to keep us on the ground, he's got to find small teams of people with very light vehicles, continually launching unmanned aerial vehicles into the battle space. I don't think he can do it. And it's a very affordable way, again, to get mass into the battle space at times and places of our choosing, which we have trouble doing in this highly contested environment.
Thank you. I'll go to the online questions now. There is kind of following nicely from this, a question about Ukraine and all of the sort of tactical innovation we've seen on the battlefield where, you know, you have cardboard drones literally being flown from the front lines. And so I want to actually turn this over to Anna to talk for a minute about some of the major lessons learned we should have in terms of innovation on the tactical edge. What have you seen there? And what do you think, if anything, applies to US forces?
Thank you, Caitlin. I think I can, speak more for the European forces here, and maybe someone on the panel could comment for the lessons learned for the US forces. But Ukraine is really, a test kitchen of a sort, and this experimentation, and right now that we are seeing that calls sort of for focusing on those innovations and implementing them as soon as possible, and it's just such an important thing to do and to take it to the operational level, and I think that that center that NATO and the joint NATO and Ukraine center that is being established right now, and there has been a feasibility study, and it's being actually stood up right now, and it will be officially launched at the Washington summit in July. It will be really critical to capture all those innovations and to really turn them into the lessons learned that can be applied really quickly all across the alliance. So not only to the US but really across all the alliance.
Thanks, Anna. And with about 5 minutes left, I want to go into a bit of a lightning round where we just get some final remarks from our panel. And so for Dave, General Hinote, Andy, and Mike, I have sort of the same question. I'll repeat it for you if you need it. But if you were Secretary of Defense for a day, David Ochmanek, what is the one thing you would do to improve US national security?
Well, it'd take more than a day, but we in our remarks, in our work, we focused deliberately more on the operational concept than on the eaches required to implement that concept. I think if the Department of Defense could quickly arrive at a consensus about the way the joint force needs to fight in the future in these highly contested environments, that in itself would be an accelerant to innovation. We're not there yet. There's something called the joint warfighting concept. It needs to aspire to be as specific about future warfare and operations as air-land battle was in the 1980s. We need to tell future commanders how to employ the forces available to them. We're not there yet. I would put my priority efforts on creating consensus around that.
Thank you. General High Note, SecDef for a day.
Yeah, so my answer would kind of build on Dave's. And I would do it in a very interesting, so there is something called the joint warfighting concept. I was one of the people that helped to make that possible. And one of the blue commanders that tested it out in some of our war games. And I believe in it. I don't believe it's quite specific enough, but it's getting there, and every iteration gets better. The very interesting conundrum right now is that if you look at the combatant commanders, and I'm going to pick on Indo-PACOM because we've been talking about that area, their O plan has to account for the forces that they have today. The joint warfighting concept accounts for forces that we're investing in or should invest in, and the two shall never meet. And what I would do is I would actually bring those together and start pointing out ways that we can start implementing the joint warfighting concepts into the operational planning. Right now, those are different parts of the Pentagon. I know that comes as a shock to several of you, but what we've got to do is we've got to look at our current planning, realize it's got some big flaws, look at the future joint warfighting concept, see how some of those flaws get better, and start that movement conceptually from today to tomorrow. What would that look like? It would look like me looking at the operational planning as it exists today, and it would not be a comfortable discussion, and we'd start with the assumptions because I don't think the assumptions are realistic. And so as Secretary of Defense, this is something that is within the purview of the Secretary of Defense to pick apart the current planning and to say how it can get better and start holding the services accountable for closing those gaps. That would bring the combatant commanders and the services together in ways that it does not happen today. And that's something that the Secretary of Defense could really do. That would be a big help.
Thank you. Andy, SecDef for a day.
I would bring to this problem an enormous sense of urgency. The time is here. We know, and we've discussed earlier, resources remain ample. General High Note's right. This is not one where we need more money. What we need is urgency. In a recent book I wrote, one of the people we interviewed was former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. And we were pressing him on some of these questions, and he had a very interesting observation, and it was this, that only two people in the Department of Defense can say yes, the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Everybody else has a chance to say no. I want to see General High Note and his successors having more of an opportunity to say yes, obviously through their service chiefs. We have to empower the people that have ideas, that know the solutions, who are on top of the scorecard that we've written here, to be able to say yes and get moving.
Thank you. Mike.
Yeah, very much in that vein. It's kind of ironic that my least favorite modern Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, did come into office and write what was later known as the Anchor Chain Memo, where he said essentially exactly what Andy just said, which is that the insightful, dedicated professionals in our defense establishment are held back by the chains of bureaucracy that's not letting us make the kind of changes that we need. So if I were there for a day, I would go to the president and I would say, I need your support to make some sometimes very unpopular and difficult changes. And if I don't get that, I'd maybe go back to just kind of managing things. I would go to a number of key members on the Hill and say, I need your support to push through some things. And I would start picking some of these areas. We've talked about allies and partners. There's a whole discussion to be had about all the bureaucratic barriers to adequate engagement with allies and partners, starting with ITAR and everything else. Pick a few of these areas, get groups together to quickly identify needed changes and begin to take a sledgehammer to the barriers to doing what we need to do. Because if that doesn't happen, I guarantee that we will be back at this desk in 6, 7, 8 years, having exactly the same discussion, having understood what needed to change, but watched it not change yet again.
Thank you, Mike. With that, we're going to conclude our panel today. I want to say such a huge thank you to all these panelists after your remarks. I always felt like I wanted to say amen to that. These are really the smartest people in their field. And thank you all. Sorry we didn't get to all the online questions. There were a lot, but hopefully this was edifying, and have a wonderful Friday.